Well, bleak wool. The producer, Mr. Katz, around somewhere. Look, this country and Western Europe is going through a transformation reminiscent of the 1920s and 1930s. And today I'd like to look at the nexus or the connection between fear, economic insecurity, corporatisation, globalisation, and the growth of neo-fascism in the Western world. It's a mouthful, isn't it? Fear, economic insecurity, corporatisation, globalisation, and the rise of neo-fascism in the Western world. And everywhere around the Western world and the settler-based societies like Australia, United States, Canada, we are seeing a rise of neo-fascism amongst people. And we need to understand what's happening, because currently we're in the middle of a political process where the opposition, Liberal National Party, and the federal ALP are in a competition that is widening the fault lines in this country. Historically, corporatisation and globalisation is not a new phenomenon. We saw it in the past. But what we've seen is the growth of corporatisation and centralisation. And what that means is that in a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit, where people's security is inherently tied to their job or business activities, we see a growing wave of insecurity. As climate change destabilises the climate, and the number of refugees and asylum seekers cascades, people in the West feel under threat. It's not just a matter of asylum seekers and refugees and migration, but the dilemma is how corporatisation and globalisation has basically shut down local production and has exported work which was normally performed by people into this country into low-wage, non-unionised, authoritarian regimes. And this has always been a feature of Australian society, where those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication have widened fault lines between groups of people. We saw this with the Chinese in Australia in the 19th century. We saw it with the importation of Kanak slave labour in Queensland and northern New South Wales in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And we saw the reaction to that economic insecurity when the new Australian Constitution was drawn up and Parliament sat for the first time on the 1st of January 1901. And the first piece of legislation which went through Parliament was the White Australia policy. There was one dissension in the whole of the upper and lower house. So that economic insecurity especially in a period when there was no social security system, widen those fault lines and blame the other. Fast forward to the 21st century. We have exactly the same conditions. Fear. Not the fear of being bombed daily, as we see in Gaza, a real fear based on reality. But fear has always been part and parcel of Australian life. Fear of insecurity is at the heart of that fear. The fear that you cannot participate in society because of economic conditions which have been created to maximise profits at the expense of everyone. So we've seen a growing fear based on insecurity, which is based on corporatisation and globalisation, spreading across the Western world. It's real, it's palpable. Because people know, in an era where there are increasing interest rates, where there are super profits made by corporations, where corporations pay minimal taxation, where tax avoidance is a national sport amongst the corporate sector, people understand that their economic well-being is tied in to that ability to earn an income. Historically, what has happened is that the growth of the social security system in the West has buffered, to some degree, the worst excesses of economic insecurity. But in the 21st century, the destruction of the social security system by successive governments who are hostage to the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, has created a situation in this society which is feeding growing neo-fascism based on racial divisions, not just in this country, but the whole of the West. And in sovereign nation state after sovereign nation states in the West, and the settlements which were created by the West through its colonisation of much of the world, we are seeing those divisions, those economic divisions, increase rapidly. And those that bear the brunt of that change are not people in government positions, they're not people who are employed by government, but they're people who have to rely on the private sector in order to survive. So if you find yourself in a situation where the wages you receive for your efforts don't actually meet your costs, then you create dissension in the community. You increase fault lines. And when you have political parties aided and abetted by a media which is owned by the corporate sector and a government gilded ABC, what you see is a race to the bottom. And that race to the ethical and moral and intellectual bottom results in the creation of conditions which are favourable to the growth of neo-fascism. But not a neo-fascism based on breaking down the power of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange, communication, but a neo-fascism based on race, which is aided and abetted by corporations whose only responsibility to society is to create ever-increasing profits irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs. And when you have movements using nationalism to promote their brand of racial superiority, we see the growth of neo-fascist movements which are based on such nebulous concepts as race. There's no DNA for race. Race is a cultural construct, but it's a visible cultural construct where it's very easy to divide people on the basis of their appearance or the language they speak. And when you have governments which are dominated by corporations who set the parliamentary agenda, who don't care, have no interest in trying to prevent the widening of the fault lines in this society, you see the growth of neo-fascism. Now, you may think I'm exaggerating, but the fact is, everywhere you look, including this country, every day we see more and more people looking for simple solutions to issues that have been created by the domination of every aspect of our existence by an economy which is based on private investment for private profit. And historically, we have seen over and over and over again what happens. The 20th century was the century of revolutions for one very good reason. Because people were sick and tired of being exploited. And they believed they could use the state apparatus in order to ameliorate, improve their situation. And that occurred through legislation, which brought in things like universal health insurance in this country during the Whitlam era, like wage security, holiday pay, sickness pay, tenure. And what we've seen over the last 50 years during the globalisation, privatisation, corporatisation, deregulation revolution is that the state has been superseded by the corporate sector and their need to create profits irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs, ever increasing profits, which are extracted ultimately from our labour, whether we're self-employed or whether we're employed by someone else. The fact is, it's our labour which creates that profit. And if they're willing to manipulate the system to increase the fault lines in this country, to divide us on the basis of the language we speak or where we come from or the colour of our skin or whether we are indigenous or not, then you create that situation which allows neo-fascism to grow. And the dilemma is with neo-fascism, whether it's masqueraded as a libertarian nationalism or the old-fashioned Nazi party, social nationalism, the fact is the end point is the same. Increased centralisation of power, increased authoritarian legislation, increased power by being exerted by political movements which take over the state apparatus. And when the corporate sector, as we saw in Germany in World War I, to a lesser extent in Italy in World War I and II, throw its hand behind a growing neo-fascist movement, then we see the excesses that occurred during World War I and World War II repeated ad nauseum. And that's exactly where we are moving to as a society. The traditional forces against neo-fascism have disappeared. State-centralised socialism, state-centralised communism have been found to be nothing more than mirror images of neo-fascism. Things we should be looking at is a universal basic income. So we don't have that economic insecurity which feeds to the growth of a neo-fascist movement because of increasing economic insecurity, because of the state being hijacked by the corporate sector. We are facing real dilemmas as a societies. Parliamentary democracy has failed. Communism has failed. Socialism has failed. Fascism has failed. And the dilemma is that with growing economic insecurity, people look to the past for solutions for them. We need to remember that we are part of a society, part of a community. We are not just citizens in a sovereign nation state. We need to remember that universal human values are ultimately the only way that we can get out of this cul-de-sac we find ourselves in currently. Universal human values, universal basic income, increasing inequality, the centralisation of power, both in an economic realm and in new and old media, have created this perfect situation, this perfect storm that has created that insecurity which more and more people are feeling, whether it's based on the climate emergency, whether it's based on increasing inequality because of increasing corporate profits, whether it's based on a belief system that you think somehow you're better than somebody else. The fact is that we are marching blindly towards that end that we saw in Western Europe in the 1920s and 1930s.